Never miss an episode of the LJS podcast. Become a subscriber at learnjazzstandards.com/newsletter and get all of the latest from Learn Jazz Standards sent right to your inbox. That's learnjazzstandards.com/newsletter.
All right, welcome to the show. I'm your host, Brent Vartstra. You're listening to the LJS podcast, the podcast where you get weekly jazz tips, interviews, stories, and advice for becoming a better jazz musician. I want to welcome all of our listeners from around the world. And if you're listening from our home base on LearnJazzStandards.com, welcome. If you're listening on iTunes, welcome. YouTube, welcome, or any other source where you're listening to today's podcast, welcome to the show. We really appreciate you coming in to listen and take part of your day to join us. And on today's episode 45, I got a really special guest on the show today. He's been on before for a couple other episodes, and I always really love having him come back because he's just got a really brilliant mind for music, brilliant mind for jazz and jazz education, and that's Josiah Bornasian, saxophonist. He is a teacher at the University of Miami, as well as doing his doctorate there, so he's just a really good guest to have on the show today. And the question we're asking on today's show is really appropriate for our guest, and it's, should I go to college for jazz? Okay, should I go to college for jazz? And we're going to be answering for those students that are in college right now or thinking about going to college, if they're thinking about getting a career in jazz, in music, if they should go to college. And this is also a show for even just hobbyists who aren't interested in that but are thinking about going to college to further their jazz education, or even for those that are just interested in the topic. Now, before I bring Josiah on, yesterday in the United States, we celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Martin Luther King, of course, was the great civil rights leader, and he fought for social justice in the United States. And so I thought a great way to honor him would be to read a bit of his speech from the 1964 Berlin Jazz Festival. This was his opening address, and it really ties together his life's work, his mission with jazz, and what jazz means to all of us. So let me read a bit of his speech here. Jazz speaks for life. The blues tell the story of life's difficulties, and if you think for a moment, you will realize that they take the hardest realities of life and put them into music, only to come out with some new hope or sense of triumph. This is triumphant music. Modern jazz has continued in this tradition, singing the songs of a more complicated urban existence. When life itself offers no order and meaning, the musician creates an order and meaning from the sounds of the earth which flow through his instrument. It is no wonder that so much of the search for identity among American Negroes was championed by jazz musicians. Long before the modern essayists and scholars wrote of racial identity as a problem for a multiracial world, musicians were returning to their roots to affirm that which was stirring within their souls. Much of the power of our freedom movement in the United States has come from this music. It has strengthened us with its sweet rhythms when courage began to fail. It has calmed us with its rich harmonies when spirits were down. And now jazz is exported to the world. For in the particular struggle for the Negro in America, there is something akin to the universal struggle of modern man. Everybody has the blues. Everybody longs for meeting. Everybody needs to love and be loved. Everybody needs to clap hands and be happy. Everybody longs for faith. In music, especially this broad category called jazz, there's a stepping stone towards all of these. That was the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a great man that deserves a lot of honor from us this week. Okay, now let's jump into the show with Josiah Bornasian. All right, we're back on the show with special guest Josiah Bornasian, saxophonist, part-time teacher at the University of Miami, and getting his doctorate. Josiah, thanks for coming back on the LJS podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
All right, so today we're asking the question, and this is something that you being in this scene right now, and me having gone to college for music, specifically for jazz, we're asking the question today: should I go to college for jazz? Okay, so maybe there's some students listening to the show right now that are thinking about whether they should pursue music as a career, or whether that's going to help them become a better musician in general, if that's a good path for them. So first of all, let me just ask you that basic question. Should a student go to school for music, and why?
Okay, well, this is obviously a huge topic, and I'm just going to preface it by saying, first of all, I'm in the higher education world, so I do have a little bit of a vested interest in continuing jazz education in higher education. But also, at the end of the day, I'm really concerned about just improving the quality of jazz in general as a culture. So
Right.
I think the most important thing is that everybody makes the best decision for them. So it's a huge topic, but to break it down, the most simple, big two categories for me are, should I go to college for jazz? Okay. Well, first of all, there's the career side of that, and then there's the sort of creative musical side of that.
Right. So there's the side of it where it's like, well, I actually want to make money off that, and that's the reason why I want to get involved in this, or I just want to become a better jazz musician or musician in general.
Yeah. So let's start with the general question that's more career focused. So that's basically the question of should I go to college if I want to make a career in jazz? Or do I have to go to college if I want to make a career in jazz? Mm-hmm. So if that's important to you, then first you need to ask that question of yourself is, am I playing jazz because I want to make a living playing jazz? Or am I playing jazz just because it's something that's fun and that enriches my life and that's creatively fulfilling? So if you do want to make a living playing jazz, I know a lot of you are going to want a really cut and dry, really easy yes or no question, but I think that there is no immediate yes or no question. I think there's a series of follow-up questions you have to ask yourself. So if you say, yes, I want to make a career out of jazz, one of the next questions you need to ask yourself is your finances, right? Because college is a huge expense.
Well, it's expensive. People go into a lot of debt over college.
Yeah, I think the median right now, or the average for an undergraduate degree in America, is around $36,000 worth of debt, which is a lot of money. So you've got to first think about your finances, and is it going to be financially feasible? There's a lot of good resources out there, but one of the general good rules of thumb is that you should never accrue more debt for your undergraduate degree than you reasonably expect to earn in your first year out of school. So let's say you want to go to, kind of a swanky private school, and you end up racking up, maybe $100,000 worth of student loan debt. That's very common, very common. You got to honestly ask yourself, am I with a liberal arts degree or with a humanities degree or with a jazz degree, am I going to honestly be making $100,000 a year my first year out of college? And if the answer is no, then you really want to caution against that particular choice of school, and then maybe even caution against going to school for jazz in general. So that's a big thing, finances.
I can actually speak to that, because when I first started my bachelor's degree for music, and it was a jazz performance degree, I was going to a private art school in Seattle, and great school. It was excellent. But what I was realizing early on is that I didn't think that was going to be sustainable for the amount of money I expected myself to make when I got out, because I was under no illusion that musicians in general tend not to make very much money. And just in case you thought that most musicians end up becoming incredibly successful and making lots of money, Josiah, I think you could attest to this as well. That's just not the case.
We're not rich.
We're not.
we're not the 1%.
We are not the 1%. And playing music is more about money. Even if you decide to make it a career, it's about enjoying what you're doing in life. And hopefully that's what everybody is doing their best to do, whether privileged to do so or not. But I realized that going to that private school wasn't going to be sustainable. And there's other reasons for me moving to New York, obviously, as a jazz musician. But I moved to New York, a big reason was because I was going to a public school where there was still good teachers, still good opportunities in the education realm through this school, and it was cheaper. to go to this school. And that was really me thinking in the long run, like, well, how much money am I going to make getting out of here? You have to make the right decision.
Yeah, and so there are a lot of options. I mean, you can get potentially get federal financial aid, but it's really important that if you're looking into that you make sure that you understand the difference between a loan, a federally subsidized loan, and a grant or a scholarship. Because obviously grants or scholarships or gifts, that's money that's yours. You don't have to pay it back. But loans, even if it's attractive because it says it's part of your federal aid package and maybe it's a subsidized loan with perhaps a lower interest rate, it's still a loan. You still have to pay it back when you're out of school. So it's really important that you investigate the whole financial reality. How much is the tuition going to cost at the school? Are there any other fees you're going to have to pay? Like some schools will pay for your private lessons, some schools won't. What's the cost of living going to be? And is that going to be covered with your tuition or not? Are you going to have to stay on a dorm and pay for a dorm, or are you going to have to move to a city like New York where it's a high cost of living? And how are you going to foot the bill for your cost of living? So that's one really important consideration is finances. So
what's another? That's an important one. What's another thing people should consider when trying to decide whether to go to college or not for a career in jazz?
For me, the next big thing is going to be the connections of the university. So as you're investigating potential schools you might want to go to, you want to also, again, look at the location. Is the school going to be in a location that's going to be able to connect you into a music scene where you're going to actually be getting gigs, getting calls to recording sessions, creating other economic opportunities for yourself to make a living? So location is big, and then also faculty are really important. So again, one of the trade-offs is sometimes the more expensive schools have, bigger name faculty members, and so you've got to really ask yourself, am I actually going to get a lot of face time with the faculty members by going to the school? Does it make more sense to just move to the city that the school is in, not pay the money for tuition, and see if I can track down the people on my own? And then in general, think about, okay, are the faculty well connected? Are they going to be there for you while you're learning, and also be able to give you connections for you to actually make a career in music when you graduate?
Well, here's a question that I have, because I know when I was first looking for colleges for my bachelor's degree, one of my teachers was really diehard on just go to the school that has the best teacher. It doesn't really matter where it is. I mean, you want to go, be someone's protege, essentially is what he's trying to say. Do you think for someone who's actually trying to make a career out of music, out of jazz, do you think it's more important to go to some place that has great connections or great teachers? Like if you had to choose between one of the two?
I would say great teachers, and then furthermore, I would actually problematize that and say that I agree with your teacher's philosophy in that the foundation of the jazz culture and how people learn to be jazz musicians is through the mentorship model. A classic example is Miles Davis. So, and you can even go back. We'll start with Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong basically joined, King Oliver's band and developed a mentorship. Miles Davis moved to New York and basically followed Bird and Dizzy around and developed a mentorship relationship with them, and so on and so forth. You can go down the line of history, and one after another, you see younger jazz musicians moving to follow a master jazz musician, studying with them, going to their gigs, trying to sit in, just hanging out with them and absorbing through osmosis, how to be a jazz musician and how to make a living. You don't have to go to school to do that. And in some situations, it might be a lot cheaper and make a lot more sense to not go to school, but to find a mentor and take a small fraction of the money that you would spend at a university and invest that in getting private lessons and in doing other things like maybe, putting together your own recording projects. So the mentorship model is really important. And again, you don't have to go to school to do that, but oftentimes going to a school will really facilitate that. And especially if you have no other way to kind of move to a new city and get yourself anchored, going to a school can really help you get anchored in a new city and give you a ready-made community of people.
Community, I think, is a really key term you just used. Having that community. I think that's what college really did for me ultimately is it just set me up with a community of musicians to base off of, and more than just to play gigs with later on or to network with, but just to learn from each other. Because honestly, I think that's I always say this, on this podcast and the blog, that you need to be surrounding yourself with the jazz community. And that is super important for your education as well. And college can be a great medium for establishing that community. Sometimes it can be harder without that, depending on what kind of a scene you're in.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm really fortunate. I went to the California State University, Northridge for my undergraduate degree. And I got everything. I got the full package. It was a very affordable public university. I had world-class mentors, Gary Pratt, Matt Harris, John DeVersa, who also had great connections and directly connected me into composing opportunities, composing commissions, gigs, introducing me to other people who became teachers and mentors. And that school has a great community. They've got their own dedicated jazz classrooms where people have codes and they can go and there's a physical space for them to hang out. So, and then obviously City College, I was fortunate. I went there for my master's degree, and that's where we met.
Yep.
So there was
City
a nice,
College in New York.
there was a great, nice community there, and we got to interface with world-class musicians like John Patitucci and Ray Gallen and Steve Wilson. And now I'm at the University of Miami getting a doctorate, and I'm teaching part-time there. And there's a great community there, and there's a lot to be said for that and the connections that fosters. But I still think that the quality of the teaching is paramount, because at the end of the day, what you need to get out of your college education if you want to make a career is a jazz skill set, a skill set that's going to be viable for you to be able to perform music and then for you also to make a living for yourself. So that's really important, the connections and the quality of the teaching.
Hey everybody, just taking a quick break from today's show to talk to you about our e-course, 30 Days to Better Jazz Playing. You know, I get emails almost every day from jazz musicians asking the questions, what do I practice and how do I practice? They know where they want to be in their jazz playing, they know how they want to sound, they're just not exactly sure how to get there. And that's why me and the LJS team have created our new e-course, 30 Days to Better Jazz Playing. 30 Days to Better Jazz Playing is an audio e-course that brings you through 30 days of focused, goal-oriented practicing where you're going to be working on things that will actually improve your jazz playing. This course is designed for all instruments and for all skill levels and is really great for anybody looking to practice with purpose and to make real improvement in their jazz playing. If you want to learn more about this e-course, go to learnjazzstandards.com/30 days. That's learnjazzstandards.com/30 days. I hope to see you in the course. I think it's important also to bring this up. You touched a little bit on the fact that you don't need to go to college to work professionally. You were talking about how having that mentorship and how so many musicians have come from that school. And in a way, you know, the jazz education thing is kind of a little bit, I don't want to say newer, but, you know, traditionally through the history of the music, it is a little bit newer. That idea of going to school and getting education rather than just learning it on the streets or learning it from a teacher, learning it from a scene in the clubs. So, you know, you don't have to go to college, right? I mean, we've basically listed some pros and cons, you know, the community of the college, being able to find teachers that are there, you know, they're on faculty, they're being paid, having this community that's just built in. But there's also the con of how much money it could cost. So maybe that's not the route to go. But another thing that we should talk about really quickly is what it means to actually be a professional jazz musician. Because some people are under the impression that they're going to go to school, become a really good musician, and then get out and they're going to be getting a bunch of gigs and making a living off of playing gigs. Some people are under that they think that's what's going to happen. There are some that aren't quite. They're a little more realistic and they believe, okay, well, I'm going to teach some private lessons and play gigs, and then I'm going to be cool. But the reality is that none of this stuff, especially in today's economy, will secure you a living as a musician. Would you agree?
Yeah, it's a complicated issue, and again, I would caution against kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to thinking about the issue, because so much of it comes down to what your individual priorities and goals are. So, you know, thinking about the idea of, yeah, like, should I go to school or not? Some people, like I said, they can get the full jazz education experience just by having one or a handful of mentors and following them around. But everybody has a different learning style. And so some people thrive when there's not a lot of structure, and some people really need a lot of structure. And so that might influence your decision. If you're the kind of person who needs a lot of structure in order to learn, and you know deep down that, look, hey, if I don't have a class that I have to go to, and I don't have assignments, and I don't have a teacher that I'm paying for, I'm not going to shed, and I'm not going to get my act together.
Motivation, self-motivation.
Yeah, you might be more interested in going to a school because that might provide a structure that you need. And then even within choosing schools, there's a wide variety. Some schools are a little bit more open and creative and kind of artsy, and there's fewer requirements and a lot less demands. And then some schools are a lot more regimented and rigorous and sort of demanding. So that's something to consider. And then the other thing is, that reality of what do you expect to be doing with your career afterwards. And just because you get a degree and you graduate and you've got a piece of paper, that doesn't automatically mean you're going to make a living as a jazz musician. And on top of that, because like you said, jazz is a relatively new field in higher education, but it is rapidly expanding and has been expanding for a few decades now. We do have a general experience in the country for all fields, but jazz as well, of degree inflation. So getting a bachelor's degree now doesn't really carry as much weight as it maybe did 20, 30 years ago.
Right.
And not just in the academic world, but in the world in general. And so I think at the end of the day, for a lot of people, if you're going to hire somebody for a gig, you don't really care if they've got a degree or not. You don't care if they've got the piece of paper. You care about, number one, can they play? Number two, are they professional? Do they have professional ethics and standards and values? Are they going to show up dressed appropriately to the gig? Are they going to show up sober? They're not going to be high or drunk or whatever.
Yeah.
Are they reliable? Are they going to reciprocate and hire you? And if they do, are they going to pay you on time? Are they are they going to stiff you for the bill or not? So there's all these other considerations, and I don't think having a degree is very high on most people's list of qualifications or requirements for when they're hiring musicians. So those are some other considerations for me.
Yeah, and I would say having a degree in the education realm, which I would highly encourage anyone who's really thinking about playing this music professionally or making a career out of this music, is to remember that education, it needs to be one of your top considerations. If you don't want to be a teacher in some shape or form, you should think twice about that. You should really think twice, because you're going to have to be involved in education. And a lot of times having a degree can really help you. I mean, like for you, for example, I mean, you got your master's and you're pursuing a high level of education, getting into additional programs and ultimately becoming a professor. That stuff really matters with the degree stuff and going to college stuff. And even for those who are doing teaching positions on a lower level, let's just say it's a private music studio, having a degree on there, it kind of gives you this prestige just to have a degree. So that's something to consider on an educational level.
Yeah, you definitely want to pursue at least some level of higher education if you're planning on teaching at some point. But again, also, I would caution against getting a degree just for the sake of getting a degree. I think we have a lot of sort of unconscious or unaware or unmindful decision making in this country sometimes, where they'll get a degree just because that's what you're supposed to do, right? That's what they grow up hearing or believing. And the problem with that is, again, you can really set yourself back financially, and you could be contributing to degree inflation. From personal experience, I know a lot of people who get bachelors and then go on to get masters just for the sake of getting the degree, and they don't really have a clear plan about what they're going to use the degree for. And it really devalues the entire higher education industry. It devalues the degrees for people who already have degrees, when people are kind of needlessly getting higher education degrees just for the sake of getting them. So we've got to kind of balance those, the individual concern of, I'd like to have a higher degree, versus the sort of collective industry concern of, we also need to protect the value of the degrees that are out there by not handing them out willy-nilly and having a bunch of people get degrees who aren't really necessarily going to use them.
So here's a question. I feel like in a lot of ways we've kind of answered it, but just to be explicit about the question, and for those listening today, is college the best way to learn jazz?
That's a great question. And again, I don't think that there is a cut or dry yes or no answer. I think it really varies on an individual basis because there's so many concerns. There's, again, who are the faculty at the school? What are their personal aesthetic concerns? What's their stylistic agenda? What's their pedagogical approach? How do they teach jazz? There's concerns about what's your individual goal. So again, what do you want to get out of your education? Do you want to get a set of practical jazz skills, so to speak, so you can go out and just play gigs? Or do you want to get like a really mind-expanding, creative, culturally immersive experience that's going to help you grow artistically that way? So I think it depends on those factors. Who are the teachers? Where's the location of the school? What's the school's aesthetic? And then the kind of general concern of the practical side of making a career as a musician and whether you're interested in learning that skill set versus the more creative, artistic side of being a musician, whether you're more concerned in expanding that. Because some schools will emphasize, learning standards and learning standard jazz vocabulary and recording techniques and sight reading, and then other schools will emphasize, exploring your own voice and exploring music from other cultures and so on and so forth.
I think it's important to note too that I know people that go to college for jazz or for music in general that are not trying to make a career out of it at all. They're just going there for that structured, like you were talking about before, that structured form of learning, and they're just generally interested in becoming a better jazz musician. So you could have a career already, but you're a jazz hobbyist, as a lot of listeners today are jazz hobbyists. They're not interested in making a career out of jazz, but it can still be a good place for you to further your jazz education, to get that structured atmosphere, and again, meet other musicians, a community of musicians, so that you can start playing with them, because that's where the real education comes in, is when you're actually playing with other musicians.
Yeah, and you don't have to go to school full time too. That's one of the nice things, is if you're really interested in just expanding your jazz skill set, but maybe you don't feel the need to go in an immersive full degree program, you could maybe see if you could just sign up for a couple of improv classes or sign up for a couple of jazz history classes. But it is really important to, again, think about, what are your individual needs as a person and what's your learning style, and think about the other things that school can offer. If you're not in a place like New York City where there is a built-in cultural scene and there's a lot of places to go out here and play jazz, then getting attached to a university can create a really important physical space where you've got rooms you can rehearse in, you've got, instruments you can borrow, you've got a facility where you can rehearse, and if you're in school, you've probably got more free time to experiment and explore and practice. So those are some concerns to think about as well, is what a school can provide for you if you need time and space to develop your craft.
Okay, well, let me ask you a closing question here, a personal question. If there was one thing that you wish you would have known before starting your college education, what would it be? What would you say? I wish I would have known this.
Ooh, that's a tough question. I guess I would say I wish I had been a little bit more aware of the financial realities of what you can expect to earn coming directly out of music school. And I wish, on a related note, I wish I was a little bit more aware of the impact of degree inflation. Because when I was in high school, I kind of had this grand idea that I would move from the small town I grew up in California down to Los Angeles. I'd get a bachelor's degree. Maybe I'd get a master's. I always kind of had it in the back of my mind that I'd get a higher degree. But I thought that, I could just immediately go to school, graduate, dive into the studio scene, start making a lot of money, and then just kind of self-subsidize my other stuff. And I quickly realized that the music industry is getting very, very dispersed, and in some areas of the music industry, it's very cutthroat. It's very challenging to make a living these days. You have to be very entrepreneurial. You have to be willing to wear very diverse hats, so to speak, and have a different sort of skill set. And I think a lot of people, especially younger players, will go into music education in higher ed without really being aware of the complexities of what they're diving into, and being aware of those issues of cost versus what you're going to earn, and the issue of what is your degree actually going to be worth when you attain it.
Right. I think for me, sort of along those same lines, if I were to wish I would have known one thing, is that your professors aren't necessarily going to tell you how you're going to make money when you get out of there. And this is obviously for people that are trying to do this for a career, not necessarily for hobbyists that just want to go in for some higher education. At least in my experience, I can't speak for every jazz program, just the programs I was in. There wasn't a lot of emphasis on the business of music. There was classes, but they were never really required in my case. I could have chosen to take them. I was lucky to have a little bit of intuition in this, that you have to be thinking ahead. Like, well, when I get out of college, what are the avenues? Like you were talking about, you have to have many avenues, and oftentimes you have to be an entrepreneur. How am I going to pay the bills when it's all over? You have to be thinking about that from day one. College is not going to answer that for you necessarily. And if you're lucky, you'll have some great teachers that will lead you in that direction. For me, I had very limited exposure to that. I kind of had to figure it out on my own. So if I were to say anybody who's either in college right now or thinking about going to college for whatever reason, to be considering that and keeping that in your mind when you're attending college.
Yeah, and you can talk to professors about that at the potential schools you're considering attending. It's a huge issue that professors across the country are really aware of. The faculty at all these schools are constantly debating this sort of existential issue of why do people go to school to study music, and what should they be getting out of it? Should the primary focus be on teaching them musical skills and creative skill sets only, or should they be teaching practical business concepts as well, or some mix of the two? And if it is a mix, what should that mix be? There's some schools of thought that say, just teach people how to be really good musicians first, and it's sort of like if you build it, they will come. If you're a good enough musician, you're going to get work, and you're going to sort of rise to the top no matter what at some point in time. I think there are some problems with that mentality, but there is definitely some truth to that. Mm-hmm. And then you can too easily go in the opposite direction, though, too. And you could design a so-called music degree where really the whole time you're talking too much and studying too much about branding and marketing and and all these other things, and you can kind of neglect the actual developing basic, important, fundamental musical skills like instrumental technique and having good ears and knowing how to read music and so on and so forth. So these are definitely issues that are being discussed at the highest level at universities across the country, and there's no easy resolution to them.
Yeah. All right. Well, Josiah, thanks for being on the show again, man. It's always like a pleasure to have you on. You always have such a great insight on these different topics, and we're looking forward to having you back again soon on the show.
Great. Thanks. It's my pleasure, and I hope everybody got something out of our discussion today.
All right, that's all for our show today. I want to thank you for listening. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, if you have anything to add to today's discussion, go to the show notes, go to learnjazzstandards.com, podcast, find this episode 45, and leave a comment for us in the comment section below. We always like hearing from our listeners. This is a jazz community. Now, if you want to get Josiah Bornasian's ebook, 20 Advanced Etudes for Solo Saxophone, be sure to do so in the LJS store. Again, go to learnjazzstandards.com, store in the top menu. You'll find his ebook for download there. A great ebook. I really suggest it for anybody who's looking for a challenge. It's not just for solo saxophone. It's for any instrument that can play in those range. Really great challenge, really great music to read and work on. And remember that if you get value out of today's podcast episode, please consider adding value back by leaving us a one-time, monthly, or annual donation. You can do so by going to learnjazzstandards.com/support. This just helps us continue to produce this podcast week after week. We're going to be coming out with episode 46 next week. We'll see you then.